everyone, and welcome to this masterclass on how the UK has impacted LGBT+ life around the world. My name is Pippa, and I'm very happy to be joined today by writer and campaigner Alex Leon. This masterclass is part of School Diversity Week, which is an initiative by the charity Just Like Us. School Diversity Week is a way of bringing diversity into the classroom to learn about the lives of people around us and to celebrate diversity across the country. This year our masterclasses are all online, which means that wherever you are, you will have the opportunity to view the content. And in order to make sure that this can all happen safely, we're posting a link in the comments section with all the information that you need to stay safe online. In this masterclass, we will be hearing from Alex Leon about LGBT+ life around the world and how this has been impacted by the UK. And then it's over to our amazing Just Like Us ambassadors for a Q&A session. So let's hear from our guests. Alex is a campaigner for LGBT+ rights, anti-racism and mental health provision, and his writing has appeared on Medium, The Guardian, the BBC and Huffington Post. So welcome, Alex.
Hi, Pippa. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that lovely intro. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about how has the UK impacted LGBT+ life around the world. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour because as you can imagine, this is a massive, massive topic that has sort of so many different elements to it. But I'm going to talk us a little bit through the sort of objectives of this session, and then we're going to get stuck right in. But first, you're thinking, who is this guy and why is he talking to us about this? So I kind of wanted to do just a very quick explainer as an addition to Pippa's lovely comments there at the beginning. So as Pippa said, my name is Alex Leon. My pronouns are he, him. And what am I? I'm a writer, a campaigner, an activist. As Pippa said, I've been working on mental health provision, anti-racism and LGBT rights around the world for many a year now, possibly too many years. And most recently, I was working at the amazing organization Kaleidoscope Trust. So Kaleidoscope Trust is the UK's sort of leading international LGBT human rights organization, where I learned a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking you through today. Working with LGBT activists around the world, supporting them to decriminalize homosexuality and gender nonconformity. That's kind of, I guess, where I learned the trade, so to speak, around human rights and advocacy. And now I work freelance in communications and in diversity and inclusion, and I still help charities and organizations around the world with their LGBT rights stuff. So that's me. In terms of what we're actually going to be talking about, I wanted to just really quickly talk through some of the aims of our session, just so you have a really clear understanding of what we're actually learning about. We want to better understand the role that the British Empire has played in sort of the anti-LGBT law that exists around the world, but also we want to learn about the diversity of LGBT+ people who have existed pre-colonization. They're going to be our two topics for today. So we're going to start with a question, because I love a question. We are very lucky in the UK that we exist in a country where our lives as LGBT+ people are not criminalized. I think it's fair to say that there are many topics and many issues around LGBT rights that we still have a little bit of work to do on, but at the very least, we're very lucky to not be in a country which criminalizes us. So I was going to ask a question to some of our participants today and ask them to guess, how many countries around the world do you think criminalize LGBT+ people? And what that means by criminalize is basically it makes it illegal for you to be intimate with somebody of the same sex, or also to be trans or gender non-conforming. So if you had to guess, how many countries do you think criminalize LGBT+ people? I want to get a couple of different guesses. Any idea?
I would guess maybe 8.
8, okay. On the lower end, yeah?
For me, I mean, it depends on the level, because some of them, they don't give protection, and it's sometimes the acts are illegal, but I would say at least 125 have some form of it being criminalized. Okay, yeah, on the higher end, cool.
I'd say, I think it's around like 70, 72, I think, something like that.
Riston, too smart for your own good, mate. Any other guesses?
I think about 70.
So we've got 2 correct answers. So the answer is roughly 70, and I put 70-ish. And I'm going to explain that in a second. So the reason that I put 70-ish, as Rory was kind of saying, it's complicated, right? Law is complicated. And the way that different countries criminalize LGBT people, it's just there's many different routes, sadly, to go about it. So, for example, you have countries like Nigeria, where different states in Nigeria sort of criminalize LGBT plus people in different ways. You have countries like Pakistan, where, for example, transgender people have protection in the law, but gay, lesbian, and bisexual people don't. So it's just a complicated picture, right? But roughly 70 countries have some form of criminalization in their laws. Okay, so we're gonna go through another question, which is slightly more complicated, but it's kind of in the same vein. This question is, how many of these 70-ish countries do you think have anti-LGBT laws in part due to Britain or in part due to the UK? Any guesses?
I'd say around at least 50, considering Britain was so around the world. I'd say at least 50 or 60 of them.
Yeah, good guess. Any other guesses?
I would say 50, 60 as well. The majority of them should be.
Cool. So the answer is 35. So kind of not too far from Tristan and Marco's guesses, and roughly half of the 70 countries that criminalize LGBT plus people around the world, which I think is pretty shocking, right? That's a pretty big indictment on Britain and the UK's role in creating these criminalizing laws in these countries. So the question is, how do we get here, right? How do we get to a point where 35 of the 70-ish countries in the world that criminalize LGBT plus people do so as a result of Britain in some form? And well, to explain this, you kind of have to go back a couple of hundred years and understand the origins of the British Empire and the myriad of ways that the UK has kind of invaded and colonized other countries and exported their laws around the world. But actually, when I was thinking about pulling this presentation together, I thought, okay, we'll start with the British Empire because that makes the most sense. But actually, I think our story kind of begins before then, because as we all know, as LGBT plus people have always existed, right? And so there were LGBT plus people living in the countries that were colonized by the UK before they came along, right? And they were in very many cases not only thriving and existing and being accepted, but also, you know, being really important parts of their culture and of their society. So what I wanted to do is time travel back even further to kind of pre-colonization days and give you all a bit of a kind of, I don't know, a bit of a primer on some of the LGBT plus populations that existed before colonization around the world. And I guess sort of what LGBT plus life looked like for people pre the British Empire and pre-European colonization. So this is the part where I'm doing my little music bit. So this is a boarding call for all passengers to flight LGBT around the world to learn about pre-colonization. That was I really want to do that. It's kind of corny, but I love it. So guys, we're gonna do a bit of a trip around the world, and I'm gonna talk you through some of the indigenous people that have existed in different parts of the world who are LGBT plus. So we're going to be starting off in North America, specifically in Canada, and I'll explain that in a second. Then we're going to pop down to modern day Uganda, up towards South Asia. I put a pin in Pakistan, but we're kind of looking at South Asia broadly, and then all the way across to the South Pacific, so to Samoa and to Tonga and other countries, Polynesian countries in the South Pacific. So a little bit of a note here before we get stuck in. So I'm going to be talking about populations of LGBT plus people in the past. I mean, a lot of these populations continue to exist, but I'm not going to be using terminology around lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And I just want to explain why. So the term LGBT, historically speaking, is quite a new term. It was sort of first properly used in the United States in 1988. And so although we would look at the people that I'm going to be talking about in different countries around the world as LGBT plus, at the time, they wouldn't have identified that way. And also, the terminology around LGBT is often seen by LGBT plus activists around the world who aren't from a kind of Western tradition as a sort of a Western concept. It doesn't mean that they don't identify with it in some way, but they have their own sort of indigenous terms or terms that they kind of feel more comfortable with, that kind of better speak to their particular experiences. So you might hear me in the next couple of slides talking about things like third gender or gender variant, and talking much more about same-sex attraction or same-sex intimacy than I would talk about being gay or being lesbian. Just know that that's a really conscious decision to try and, I guess, respect the cultural differences between different queer populations around the world. Ready to get started? Let's do it. So the first group that I want to talk about is Two-Spirit people in North America. So pre-colonization, many indigenous societies in North America had what you would call a third gender or a gender variant person or people. And these people were often integrated into society and played a very important spiritual and cultural role. Now, anthropological accounts suggest that these people have existed in many different, I think over 160 indigenous tribes across North America since antiquity, and they've all kind of cropped up in sort of separate indigenous tribes. So it's really important when we're thinking about indigenous tribes and indigenous people in North America to sort of not homogenize them, right? Because as you may know, they're a very diverse group of people. So the term Two-Spirit is an umbrella term, and actually it's a term that was created sort of much later. So it was created in the 1990s, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in different indigenous languages in North America, you have different terms for this idea of someone being third gender or gender variant. So in Navajo, the term is Nutle, and in Lakota, the term is Wingte, and all of these terms roughly translate to either someone who changes, someone who transforms, or sometimes man living as woman. So these Two-Spirit people or third gender people were very important in indigenous societies. Now, the term Two-Spirit, as I said, is a new term. It was invented in 1990 at a convention in Winnipeg. And the term was kind of created as an umbrella term for two reasons. A, to kind of create solidarity around people who were third gender or gender variant from different indigenous tribes and kind of create a sense of community around those people. And secondly, because a term that was being used to describe Two-Spirit people, a French term actually in Canada, which is beldache, was a term which was considered offensive. It was kind of an anthropological term which anthropologists and historians used. And it was an offensive term which comes from a French word which sort of means an effeminate man. And so they wanted to distance themselves from what was basically colonial language, right, European language, and move towards a term which kind of better encapsulated the Two-Spirit experience. Two-Spirit as an identity now is much more popular amongst Indigenous people. So often you'll find with Indigenous queer people, they will identify as queer and maybe Two-Spirit, or gay and Two-Spirit, or just simply Two-Spirit. When you self-identify as Two-Spirit, it's slightly different to traditionally being Two-Spirit, in the sense that you know, the Two-Spirit identity is very much interwoven with Indigenous cultural practices, but still there are many young people who would consider themselves, who are Indigenous, who would consider themselves Two-Spirit, particularly in Canada and in the United States. And actually one sort of interesting tidbit is that the LGBT plus acronym that we're all used to in Canada is often referred to as LGBTQI2S, and that is to designate Two-Spirit people. So moving on from North America and across to Uganda. So this man depicted here, his name is Kabaka Mwanga II Basamula Ekere. He was born in 1884. Kabaka is not part of his name, so Kabaka is a Buganda term for king, and he was a monarch of the Kingdom of Buganda, not Uganda, and Buganda is now part of modern-day Uganda. So he was a king, right? So he was king of a kingdom, and he was making very young, actually. He was making it 16. But he was known as a king to have sexual relations with both men and women. And this was very openly accepted and tolerated as part of his reign. To be honest, when you look into Mwanga II, he doesn't seem to be a particularly nice guy. He was, you know, a bit, I don't know, he just didn't seem to be particularly fond of anyone who disagreed with him, which I guess is kind of a fairly common trope amongst many a monarch in history. But yeah, so he was sort of, you know, in modern day terms, we might consider him bisexual or queer in that way. A really interesting tidbit and kind of unfortunate tidbit around Kabaka Mwanga II is that he was reigning during a time where the British were sort of first looking into, and I guess sort of making inroads towards colonizing Uganda. And they were sending missionaries across to Uganda to kind of take the temperature, so to speak. And when British missionaries were converting the Ugandan people, the Bugandan people, to Christianity, many of the, one of the things that they were taught in amongst sort of the Christian principles was a intolerance of homosexuality. So what began to happen is that many of the men that Mwanga would make advances on would reject him because of their kind of newfound religion. And there is anthropological and historical evidence to show that he would burn those men at the stake. And this is what I mean about him not being a particularly nice guy, right? And then actually, due to his unwillingness to be overthrown by the British and due to his kind of resistance against the British, he was eventually overthrown, and the throne was taken by his half-brother. Now, I wanted to include this example because it's a particularly salient example for East Africa, so Uganda, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but Uganda is known for being a particularly difficult place to be LGBT+. And Uganda is, in the region, one of the more aggressive countries to legislate against LGBT+ people. Actually, as recently as I think last month, a law was passed in Uganda, which I can't remember the specifics of it, but it was basically criminalizing, I think, the public acknowledgement or support of LGBT+ people. So, Uganda is a very difficult place to be LGBT+, but they have as part of their history a monarch or a king who was openly, in our terms, bisexual, which I think is a really interesting and kind of important thing to think about. So moving across from East Africa and over to South Asia, and this is a particular part of the world which is close to my heart as somebody who has South Asian heritage. So pictured in this photo are two Hijra women. Hijra is a term used in South Asia. It's a Hindustani word, which designates, again, a third gender or a kind of gender variant. Hijra, again, is sort of an umbrella term. So it's kind of used both for third gender people, gender non-conforming people, and intersex people, but it's also a cultural community. So you can be Hijra and you can be intersex. You can also be intersex and not be Hijra, right? So sort of a cultural and social community as well. Hijra also are a community of people who have existed since antiquity. They're actually referred to in the Kama Sutra. And culturally, and I guess this is kind of encapsulating this idea of a third gender, they weren't considered either men or women. They were sort of considered a third category. So I think the closest thing, if you were trying to approximate it into Western terms, would be something around non-binary, but it doesn't quite port in the same way. And sort of the language that we have around trans and transitioning and transgender, again, doesn't quite capture the experiences of Hijra people and Hijra women specifically. So Hijra people, Hijra women live in well-defined and organized all Hijra communities, which are run by a guru. And these are communities which have consisted over generations. Particularly in India and also in Pakistan, there is a caste system. So without getting into too much detail, people are kind of stratified into different castes. And Hijra people, or Hijra, are their own caste. And they are a very low caste, meaning that they are kind of not treated with a particular amount of reverence. But that being said, they do play an important sort of spiritual and ceremonial role. So even now, and Hijra, continue to exist. Even now, some Hijra women will make a living by going to weddings and to funerals and performing kind of ceremonies, traditional ceremonies, because a lot of people see them as having a lot of spiritual significance. Again, talking about Hijra and sort of their interaction with the British and sort of, on the cusp of colonization. During British rule, they were placed under what was called the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, which actually labeled Hijra as a criminal tribe. So they were literally considered criminals in their own country. And as a result, they were subjected to kind of compulsory registration, monitoring, and it created an enormous amount of stigma towards Hijra people in the country that kind of was already there, but the British sort of went in and they turned it up to 100 by, actually criminalizing Hijra. This was all kind of resolved and they were sort of, the act was repealed in 1952, but the stigma has kind of continued, which has been very difficult for Hijra communities. So last but not least, going over to the South Pacific, we're going to Samoa. Anyone who's ever been to the South Pacific knows that Samoa is a stunningly beautiful, honestly gorgeous country. I can't recommend it enough. I have lots of Samoan friends. I'm Australian, so it's not too far from where I'm from. So pictured in this photo are three fa'afafine. So fa'afafine is a Samoan term which designates, once again, a third gender. And actually there's lots of, I personally think there's lots of parallels to be made between fa'afafine and Hijra in terms of the role that they play in society. But in Samoan culture, fa'afafine, there's this concept called tautua, I think. And I hope that's right. Sorry to any Samoans who are watching, but there's this concept called tautua, which is sort of a concept around care for family and service towards family. And fa'afafine are usually assigned male at birth and grow up and sort of fill the traditionally female role within a family. Fa'afafine are a sort of a third gender. They have relationships exclusively with what we would say cisgender men. So Fa'afafine don't tend to be in relationship to each other, at least in a romantic way. And they are really, really accepted in Samoan culture. And to this day, I mean, there is still some stigma. And, you know, Samoa, alongside Tonga and Fiji and many of the South Pacific countries, were colonized by the British. So there was a lot of kind of stigma that arises as a part of that process. But truly, I would say from my experiences as an LGBT activist, Samoa and Polynesia in general are really interesting examples of trans people or third gender people very much being integrated into society in a way which I think for Western civilization can almost be hard to conceive, because our trajectory around trans rights has been very, very different to the Samoan trajectory. So yeah, that's 4 examples of LGBT people being accepted and tolerated and existing in different countries around the world pre-colonization. And in all of those countries, I think Samoa, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, what else did I say? Uganda and North America, in most of those countries, we still see criminalizing laws, right? So what has happened? What has happened between now and between then? How do we get from a world where gender nonconformity and homosexuality was sort of tolerated and accepted to a world where it's criminalized? Well, Britain happened. And in order for us to understand how Britain happened and how these laws got exported around the world, we kind of need to understand Britain's relationship to homosexuality and whether Britain has ever criminalized homosexuality, and if so, when and how. So now we get into a bit of British history. Can anybody tell me who this, I think, enormously flamboyant man is on the left? He should be familiar to you. At least he's familiar to me. Any ideas? No ideas?
Henry VIII?
Henry VIII. Good job. Famous for what? Having a million wives, right? Or having 8 wives? I actually can't remember how many wives. Having too many wives, let's say. So that is Henry VIII. So yes, Henry VIII was in power when the first act or the first law that was ever passed against homosexuality, or actually against sodomy. It was called the Buggery Act of 1533. So this was the first time that Britain ever explicitly outlawed any kind of intimacy between people of the same sex. Interestingly, it only outlawed men, sexual intimacy between men. And this was partly because, as you see very often in history, women were kind of not even considered in the laws that were being put together. So queer women or lesbian women or bisexual women, their sort of sexual activity, it was almost inconceivable for men at this time to imagine women being sexual towards each other without a man involved, which we can all roll our eyes at and kind of have a giggle about, because we wanted that not to be the case, right? So the Buggery Act of 1533, it kind of kick-started a history of Britain expressly criminalizing homosexual acts. Now that I'm going to kind of rattle through a couple of different acts that all kind of built on each other to sort of criminalize homosexuality more and more, but the Buggery Act was eventually repealed in 1828 and replaced by an act called the Offences Against the Person Act, which was an act which I guess was looking at all different types of kind of violent and sexual offences, of which same-sex intimacy was considered one. This was then updated in 1861 and replaced with a sort of similar law. And then in 1885, we had the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which criminalized gay men under the guise of something called gross indecency, which was a very kind of broad term, which allowed for a lot of interpretation, which meant that it was much easier to arrest and convict gay men or bisexual men. The 1885 Criminal Act Law Amendment is the amendment under which both Oscar Wilde and Alan Turing were both convicted, which I think is interesting, right? That's kind of a way of, I guess, contextualizing Britain's history of criminalizing homosexuality with some kind of well-known figures that we might have heard of before. Anyway, all of this is to say that Britain had a tradition, right, of criminalizing homosexuality. And so intolerance and denigration and a lack of acceptance around homosexuality was very much a part of the moral code of British society for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It was not accepted, right? Homosexuality was not accepted, and it was extremely taboo. Now, this becomes particularly important and relevant because all of these things, all of these acts, all of this kind of, continued criminalizing of homosexuality, it wasn't happening in a kind of historical vacuum. There was a context going on. And while some of these acts were being put in place, Britain was building an empire around the world alongside many other European powers. Now, a very, very quick explainer on European colonialism. This is such a vast topic, and it's a topic which I think it deserves much more time than we have today to give to it, but I'm going to just give you a very, very quick explainer. So in the 14 and 1500s, during what was called the Age of Discovery, Spain and Portugal were pioneering European exploration around the globe, and they were sort of subsequently building an empire for themselves. You know, the Spanish and Portuguese empires we now know as Latin America, right? South America. And Britain and many other European countries were seeing this happen and were basically getting jealous. And they were like, well, we need to compete, right? We need to sort of develop this wealth and build this wealth as well and create our own empires. And so from here on in, sort of from the 1500s, 1600s onwards, we see European powers. So we're talking Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Germany, Russia. Italy, Germany, and Russia kind of sort of less so, but they still kind of got in there. Essentially fighting for territory around the world and trying to expand their empire as much as possible and generate as much wealth as possible. As many of us will know, Britain was particularly good at this, right? Britain got very, very good at invading and colonizing countries. And at the peak of the British Empire, they controlled around 25% of the Earth's land surface, which is wild. The British Empire was the largest empire ever to exist in the history of the Earth. And that is part of the reason why we all speak English now, right? And there are sort of many sort of consequences as a result of that time. One of the things that Britain did whilst it was colonizing and plundering the rest of the world was they exported laws. They exported laws to kind of govern from afar. And I think you know where I'm going with this, right? They exported laws which reflected sort of their moral code at the time. And that's sort of what led to kind of where we are at now. So I wanted to pause for a second and just say, colonization for the vast majority of, for 99% of cases, was not done on peaceful terms. You know, many wars were fought, many lives were lost, and many people were displaced. And it was a period of enormous violence. My experience as an Australian, and I don't know if this will reflect with your experience as people who have been sort of in school and education more recently, was very much so that the British Empire was taught to me not necessarily with, I guess, a full range of perspectives, right? And there's this kind of adage or this kind of expression that history is written by the victors. And I think often when we talk about the British Empire, we forget that, you know, it was an extremely violent time. The consequences of the British Empire can still be felt today, not only in the little things like, for example, the fact that there is a Commonwealth that exists, or the fact that many of us speak English, or, you know, many of those ramifications, but also really terrible ramifications. I mean, if you look at many of the conflicts that currently exist in the world, if you trace back their history, very often, and more often than you suspect, you can trace those conflicts back to British imperialism and British colonialism, and you know, whether it's the division of territories in a way which has created regional conflict. You know, there's many. Essentially, colonialism was atrocious, and I think it's really important not to skip over that, because, you know, we're talking about the impact that it's had on LGBT plus people, and we now know that 35 countries in the world criminalize LGBT plus people as a direct result of laws that were given to them by Britain. So to explain this a little bit more, as I said, Britain was exporting laws to its colonies, and it was exporting them in something called a colonial penal code. So a penal code is a code of punishment. There was a section of that penal code called Section 377, and within Section 377, it criminalized any sexual act, quote, against the order of nature, which was a very broad and kind of ambiguous term, but was largely used to talk about homosexuality, amongst other things. There's a little map in the bottom here, which you might not be able to see super well, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about other European powers, because sometimes when I talk about this topic, people are like, yeah, but it wasn't just Britain, right? You know, all of these European countries were colonizing all around the world. So surely all these other countries are also dealing with anti-LGBT laws as well. And actually, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you see it, Britain was one of the only countries to do this. So when France and Portugal and Spain were out colonizing different parts of the world, they didn't actually have criminalizing laws in their own countries. So they didn't have anti-LGBT laws in their own societies, and so they didn't export them to their colonies. And so many of the countries that were colonized by France, Portugal, and Spain don't have as much of a history, or certainly don't have are not criminalizing homosexuality right now as a result of their European colonial powers. So an interesting kind of, and I guess not particularly fun fact, but an interesting fact nonetheless. So, okay, we know that the British Empire then fell. And again, I'm really doing like a whistle-stop tour of the history of the British Empire, but we don't have time. But there was a sort of spate of independence movements that happened across the 1800s and 1900s. And, you know, we got to a point now where many of the former colonies became their own countries, right? They became their own independent countries. But what happened in the vast majority of those cases is they kept the parliamentary and judicial systems that they inherited from the colonizers, from the UK, from Britain. And what that meant is, in many cases, they retained the penal codes. So there are a couple of exceptions to this rule. So, for example, when South Africa became independent, it completely rewrote its constitution, and as part of its constitution, very radically at the time, it protected LGBT people, which is amazing. But many countries didn't, and that's sort of how we've gotten to where we are now. And this is where we are now, as I've already said, right? So 35 countries out of the 70-ish that criminalize homosexuality or gender nonconformity do so as pretty much a direct result of British Empire, British colonialism, British imperialism, and the kind of exportation of a particular way of seeing the world. So I wanted to end on a positive note, right? So this is some pretty tricky and difficult history, and not particularly nice history for us to reflect on, but there are some really exciting and positive things that are happening now, some of which I've been a part of, and I want to kind of end on a note of kind of talking about what successes that we can celebrate that have happened in the recent past. So many of you will remember that quite famously, fairly recently, India decriminalized homosexuality. So they repealed Section 377, which is the Section 377 of the British Colonial Penal Code that I was telling you about before. So that was repealed in India in 2018, which was just honestly like a wonderful, amazing thing, which I was really lucky to know some of the people that were involved in that case. And it was super, super exciting. In 2016, both Belize and the Seychelles decriminalized homosexuality, and in 2019, Botswana decriminalized homosexuality as well. Out of interest, there are two main ways that activists, grassroots activists and campaigners tend to get homosexuality decriminalized. So one is legislative reform. So it means basically campaigning and advocating to government to reform their legislation so that it doesn't criminalize homosexuality or gender nonconformity. And the other one is litigation. So in the case of both Belize and Botswana, essentially private citizens sued the government to say that you are infringing on my constitutional rights to whatever it may be, so freedom of expression or whatever it may be. Both in 2019 and in 2016, with Belize and with Botswana, they won, right? So they won, and then the government was like, okay, well, we now have to change these laws because it's been proven in court that they are unconstitutional or they are unfair or illegal or whatever it may be. So those are some kind of recent wins that I think are really worth celebrating. I wanted to talk a little bit about what the UK government has done, because there's been some, there's been some ups and some downs. So former Prime Minister David Cameron, famously of referendum-inducing fame, he kind of made a big splash is not quite the right word. He kind of made waves, let's say, in 2011, when Uganda was considering a particularly pernicious anti-LGBT law, by saying that he would withdraw aid money, so international aid money to Uganda over their anti-LGBT laws. This was really controversial. In fact, actually, I'm going to pose you a question. Why do you think this may have been controversial? Why do you think it might have been controversial for David Cameron to say we're going to stop giving aid money to Uganda because of their record on gay rights? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so it's say not giving aid negatively impacts gay people, LGBT people in Uganda as well, so they will suffer. So it's not really good for them.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a brilliant answer, Marco. Who else was going to jump in? Because there's sort of multiple aspects of this answer.
Yeah, so it's pretty much going to be exactly the same as what Marco said. Like the rest of the population who are not LGBT would also suffer as a direct result of withdrawing aid.
Totally. So Charlie and Marco, you got the nail on the head. So that was one aspect, right? Was that, withdrawing aid from a country impacts everybody, including the LGBT people in that country. And so it kind of seemed like a bit of a strange decision. I mean, David Cameron eventually withdrew the suggestion and it didn't happen. The other thing is, and this is something that I wanted to talk about, is that it came across to many people in the international kind of diplomatic community as quite neo-colonial. And so neo-colonial is a term, if you're not familiar with it, which is essentially kind of, it means that it was kind of replicating when David Cameron was saying to Uganda, if you don't do this thing, we're going to take some things away from you. It was kind of replicating the kind of circumstances of a kind of a colonial power and then a colony, right? Of saying, we're the people that know what's right for the world, and we say that you should do X, and if you don't do X, we're going to punish you, right? And there is a particular sensitivity around this because Uganda was colonized by Britain, so it felt inappropriate and kind of patronizing to East Africans and to Ugandans specifically that this white Western country, first of all, who came into the country and introduced anti-gay laws, would now hundreds of years later turn around and finger wag and say, hey, those gay laws that you've been building on that we actually introduced to you, they're very bad, so you should stop doing it. So it was a controversial move, and it didn't work, and it was kind of panned by also, people in the UK, diplomats in the UK who were just like, this is not the way to do it. So that was a kind of a false start, I guess, for the UK government. But then in 2018, and I was really lucky to be a part of this, Theresa May made a statement of regret where she said that she regretted Britain's legacy of anti-gay laws across the world. And actually, interestingly, not just anti-gay laws, but also laws which could be considered anti-women. So there's lots of laws that have been exported to British colonies that are also quite regressive when it comes to things, for example, like marital rape not being considered rape, or particular forms of sexual assault not being considered sexual assault, and all stemming from these penal codes. So the statement of regret was campaigned extremely hard by LGBT activists around the world, and I was really lucky to be a part of the kind of contingent of people who were campaigning the UK government on this. And not only did Theresa May make a statement of regret, which was frankly long overdue, because this was the first time that the British government had ever formally and officially acknowledged its impact on different countries around the world in regards to anti-LGBT laws, but it also she also gave, I think it was £5.6 million to LGBT organizations and offered up to any former colony who wanted to repeal or reform their laws, the UK government's help. So it was a really big positive step forward to the criminalization of LGBT plus people across the world being acknowledged by the UK government, and also the UK government taking some responsibility for the suffering of LGBT plus people, not only then, but also now in modern day society. So last but not least, I wanted to give a shout out to the Commonwealth Equality Network. So as you'll know, probably, many of the former British colonies came together to form, it's called an intergovernmental organization. It's basically just a bunch of governments get into a room every now and again and, talk about interesting things, called the Commonwealth of Nations. And the Commonwealth Equality Network was a network which was set up in 2013 to kind of combat and create solidarity amongst LGBT activists in different Commonwealth countries all over the world, so that they could basically support each other to try and, help each other to decriminalize homosexuality and kind of, I don't know, provide a space of solidarity and sharing and camaraderie. So this is a photo of myself. You might recognize Lady Phil, the bottom left-hand corner, who did a masterclass for Just Like Us last year, with a bunch of amazing, honestly, like incredible pioneering LGBT plus activists from across Asia and the Pacific. So in this one photo alone, we have representatives from Sri Lanka, Singapore, Pakistan, Samoa, Tonga, Tuvalu, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Kiribati. It was an incredible meeting. And as part of the Commonwealth Equality Network, we were doing these meetings all around the world, trying to get activists talking to each other and supporting each other. And so I just want to shout out to this organization as well, because it's an incredibly important organization for creating positive change for LGBT plus people in criminalizing countries in the Commonwealth. So that's it. And I actually don't think that I have a finishing slide. I think that this is my end slide. So thank you so much for your attention. I really hope that you were able to learn something about the UK and Britain's kind of colonial legacy in terms of LGBT plus people. I hope it was interesting. I hope you learned something. And yeah, I guess onto the Q&A.
Alex, thank you so much. Yeah, we're going to go on to some of the questions from the ambassadors. And I think the first one is from Freya.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. And I really wish that this sort of thing would be covered in British history classes, like in schools. I think it'd be really important. So my question is, how did you learn about LGBT plus human rights around the world?
Thank you, Freya. And I wish that too. I think it's important that we are really honest about our history, right? As the UK and as about Britain, and talk about the bad things as well as the good. So for me, as I mentioned in the presentation, I am South Asian. So my dad is from Sri Lanka. It's a bit confusing because I was born in Australia. My mum is British, and it's all, you know, I'm a citizen of the world, as we say. But I was really interested because I went to India and Sri Lanka quite a lot growing up I realized very early on in my journey of being LGBT and understanding who I was as a gay man that I had many privileges afforded to me that I didn't in other parts of the world. And partly because I have family overseas and in a country like Sri Lanka where it's criminalized, I think very early on in my journey of being queer, I realized that, you know, people out there have it a lot harder than I do. And it was always my dream to work in LGBT human rights. It was just a topic of mine that I thought, a passion project for me, and something that I thought was incredibly important and often not really talked about. I mean, so much of the LGBT kind of conversation that we have in this country is about Britain. And a lot of the conversations that we have aren't necessarily focused on some of the most sort of difficult areas to be LGBT. And I just wanted to work on that. And so I started working for Kaleidoscope Trust, which is a brilliant organization based here in the UK, and alongside Lady Phil and some of my other amazing colleagues, and just sort of dived into the world of human rights advocacy and supported LGBT activists in any way that I could. And now I'm here. And you know, one thing that I'll say is it's almost hard to explain, but the activists I have worked with are genuinely some of the bravest, and I don't want to say inspirational because it almost sounds a bit kind of like, oh, but they are genuinely inspirational people who sacrifice their safety and their security almost daily in many cases because of an injustice that they face. And I would encourage anyone who cares about these issues to look up Kaleidoscope Trust, look up the Commonwealth Equality Network, and get involved, because, you know, activists across the world, they need resources, they need people to volunteer, they need your time. And it's a really, really important and often underserved topic and issue. So yeah, thanks for your question, Freya.
That's brilliant, Freya. I think the next question will also tie in really well with what you just said, which comes from Rory, I think.
Hi, Alex. Thank you very much for your talk. Maybe you did already touch upon this. Maybe there's more you can say about it. But my question is, what have been positive changes for LGBT plus people around the world in the last year? And, you know, if you feel you've kind of, those are all the countries where it's been legalized, maybe you can talk about the countries where maybe we could be on the verge of things really improving, and, you know, what to look at, what is starting to change. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rory. Thank you. I think a really interesting part of the world to look at is Kenya. So I mean, time feels like a bit of an illusion because of 2020, but I think it was in 2019, Kenya was litigating against the state. Kenyan activists were litigating against the state to decriminalize homosexuality. And unfortunately, the answer was no, the court ruled not in their favor. But Kenya is and East Africa in general, I would say, is a really interesting place. There's a lot of movement in Kenya. There's a really strong LGBT grassroots movement in Kenya, and LGBT people I guess, tend to be slightly more accepted than in other parts of the continent. So I would say Kenya is a really exciting place. I think, to be honest, I think we're seeing. I was going to talk about some challenges that we're facing actually, which is maybe not so positive, but I think we're seeing a lot of movement as well in the Caribbean. So we're not actually necessarily seeing laws being changed, but we're seeing, you know, the Caribbean for a long time, particularly Jamaica, was seen as one of the worst places to be gay in the world. But similarly to East Africa, I think there's lots of really exciting movements in the Caribbean in general, particularly in St. Lucia. There's a lot of litigation going on in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is kind of like international, it's a human rights court for the Americas region. So I'd say those are the two areas to keep an eye on. But largely, yeah, I kind of covered Botswana. I mean, India also. India was massive because India is one of the most populous countries in the world, right? And they probably contain the most amount of LGBT plus people than any other country or close to it. So, so yeah, those are the big ones, I think.
Thank you very much. And yes, let's hope for the best in Kenya.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rory. Our next question comes from Tristan.
Hi, yeah. So as a history student, I absolutely loved hearing about LGBT plus stuff like pre-colonialism, especially as we don't really talk about it, as Freya said. So my question is, what would you say the biggest challenges are when it comes to the UK undoing its past wrongs that have negatively impacted LGBT plus communities around the world?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think a lot of it comes down to perception. One of the things that I find really frustrating is that there is still, for many people who don't know this history, and it's not always necessarily ignorance or ignorance on purpose, but for many people who don't know this history, there's a lot of kind of like finger wagging and patronizing of like, oh, these ridiculous backwards countries that criminalize gay people and put gay people to death. And I think it's important to acknowledge that yes, these countries are now their own independent nations that can make decisions on their laws. But I think when you divorce the present day context from the past, you start to get into territory which I think is not particularly fair. And so I would say perception. A lot of people just do not know that Britain has played such a large role in the criminalization of homosexuality and gender nonconformity across the world. And I think education, and I think this is part of the solution in a way, right? Is like talking about this. I would love to see this topic, and actually just I would love to see a reformation of the way that the British Empire is talked about in education generally in this country. But I think particularly for young queer people, I would love to see this kind of thing taught in schools around the country as well. And actually not just around the country, but also around the world. So one of the things that we forget is that, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, our education systems are roughly based on the British education system. And, the way that I was taught about the British Empire was not true to what I have since learned, right, as an adult. And I had no understanding before I started working in this field that the British had ever done anything against LGBT plus people across the world. So yeah, I think it's all about education and changing perceptions.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, Tristan.
Thank you, Tristan. Our next question, which is very related with what you just said, is from Malik.
Hi, Alex. Thank
Hey.
you for this. It's been so interesting. I think that a lot of people after this will be wondering like what they can do, and you've spoken a little bit about it already. But what would you say young people can do today to help make a difference for people facing injustices around the world?
Totally. So there's some really low-hanging fruit, I think, around this. And this isn't the only thing that you should do, but actually, if you have limited resources, this can be the only thing that you can do. Go and follow some of the amazing organizations that are out there that are doing this work. And I'll rattle off a couple for you so you can know them. Kaleidoscope Trust is based in the UK. You have Egal and Rainbow Railroad based in Canada. There's actually way more and I'm blanking, which is very annoying, but there's some really amazing organizations all around the world that, shout out about this kind of stuff. The Human Dignity Trust. There's another one that I'm forgetting it. I'm going to get in trouble from my friends who work there. But yeah, there are some really, really amazing organizations out there that are really pushing these things. And often they have really amazing social media profiles as well, where you can just learn about the different plights of different people who are faced with this, this challenge across the world. I appreciate that young people are not always necessarily money bags. I myself, just outside of the scope of a young person, I certainly am not a money bags, and I don't have a lot of spare change necessarily. But I would say that if this is a topic that you really care about, do consider donating to some of the organizations that I talked about. And also you can literally often Google, like if there's a particular country. So like for me as someone who's a really, who's from someone from the diaspora, who has Sri Lankan heritage, Equal Ground is an organization in Sri Lanka, and you can literally Google Sri Lanka LGBT rights organizations, and I give them a regular donation because I feel that there's, I feel like my ancestors would want me to do that, and so I do it. So if this is something you care about, definitely, donate. And the other thing that I would just say is like, talk to people, right? If you've learned something today about British history and the impact of British colonialism and LGBT plus people, talk to your queer mates about it, right? Just talk about it. Because I think, you know, as I was saying in the answer to Tristan's question, so much of this is around perception and education. And if you can pass on a little nugget of knowledge that helps somebody else to go, oh, that's interesting, and that's bad, and we should probably try and fix that. You're spreading awareness, and awareness is gold dust for this topic. So, yeah.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Malik. And I think our last question is coming from Marco.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. It was really fascinating and really interesting. My question is, you're a writer, a campaigner, as well as many other things. What's your favorite part about your work?
Oh, that's a nice question. Honestly, and I promise I'm not just sucking up here. I really, really love talking to young people about basically all the topics that I care about. And it's not just this. This is something that I'm incredibly passionate about. But I also think, for example, something which a lot of young people, you know, have personal experience with is, you know, mental health and the fact that so many young queer people suffer from poor mental health. And like, how can we make that better? How can we create better support places for all of us to kind of thrive as young queer people who actually the world is our oyster and sometimes we're taught that it's not. I'm also really, really passionate about embedding intersectionality in basically any conversation, right? There is no conversation, I believe, in the world where intersectionality is not or cannot be embedded into it in a really, really important way. But no, honestly, I would say it's connecting with people, it's talking to people, it's being able to educate and being able to share, and also being able to amplify the work of other queer people, particularly queer people around the world who aren't always afforded the platform that I am. So yeah. That's my answer. It's a bit of a pageant answer, but whatever. World peace. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you very much.
The pageant answer provides a great positive ending to the masterclass. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the masterclass. Thank you so much, Alexander, for being here today, and also a very big thank you to the ambassadors and everyone who's watching the session. If you would like to know more about School Diversity Week or view any of the other masterclasses, do follow us on social media. The handles are @JustLikeUs on Twitter and Instagram, and you can find us on Facebook as well. If you would like to know more about the UK's impact on LGBT plus rights around the world, please follow Alex on @Alexand_Leon. So that's Alexander Leon with an underscore between the D and the E. And to view the other masterclasses, go to justlikeus.org/masterclasses. And of course, we want everyone to engage with this in a way that is as safe as possible. So to make sure that you're up to date on how to keep yourself safe online, please take a look at justlikeus.org/betteronline. And again, thank you so much, Alex, for being here today. Goodbye for now to everyone tuning in, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.